A new poll from Suffolk University and the Boston Globe shows a tight four-way contest for the lead in New Hampshire. Senator Bernie Sanders led the field at 16%, with Senator Elizabeth Warren, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and former Vice President Joe Biden just a few points under.
According to the Boston Globe, it's been decades since this many candidates fought for the lead so soon before the state's primary. And this comes as the New Hampshire's Secretary of State announced the primary will take place on February 11th.
For more on this, let's bring in a team of CBS News 2020 campaign reporters. With us, we have Nicole Sganga from Manchester, New Hampshire. LaCrai Mitchell is in Charleston, South Carolina. Musadiq Bidar is in Des Moines, Iowa. And Alex Tin is joining us from Las Vegas. All right, so Nicole, we're going to start with you. As we mentioned, Senator Sanders and Warren appear to be maintaining their lead in the race in New Hampshire. But which candidates have seen the biggest change in support over the last months?
Well, you referenced that Boston Globe Suffolk University poll, and here's what it says. According to the poll, Mayor Pete Buttigieg from South Bend, Indiana, has gained 7 points since August, and former Vice President Joe Biden has lost 9 percentage points since August. Meanwhile, Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren, nearby neighbors here in New Hampshire, were basically unchanged. This fact, too, amongst voters over 65 years of age. According to that Boston Globe Suffolk University poll, Biden dropped from 28% in August to 12% today. Meanwhile, Mayor Pete Buttigieg has vaulted from 2% among seniors to 17%. So that's certainly an important member of the electorate, an important community, the senior community, which constantly turns out to vote here in New Hampshire. The takeaway here, though, is that only about a quarter of New Hampshire voters, according to our CBS News Battleground Tracker poll, have made up their mind. That means that this is a very fluid race, and we could continue to see jostling between these top four up until the primary, which, as you mentioned, is just 77 days away.
All right, so Musadiq, the Mayor Pete Buttigieg, certainly seems to be building momentum in Iowa. What are the factors that are really helping him in that state?
Well, Mayor Pete Buttigieg spent a lot of time here in the summer. He did a couple of bus tours, and he's going to small rural towns, not just sticking to the big hubs like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. He's also ramped up his ground operation here in the state. He's got about 130 staffers, over 20 offices, both of which put him at the top tier of candidates here. And the thing about Mayor Pete Buttigieg is his name often comes up when you're covering other candidates. This past week, I covered 3 candidates, none of who were Pete Buttigieg, but the South Bend mayor's name continued to come up in conversations with caucus goers. During my conversations, folks usually point to his intelligence, his ability to inspire them, and the way he speaks. We should also point out that Mayor Pete Buttigieg has spent a lot of money on advertisements here in the state, and as we have seen this week with one candidate dropping over $30 million on advertisements, it's a way to capture caucus goers and voters' attention who are not usually showing up to these events early on. Just in the last few days, I spoke with 3 different voters who had showed up to campaign events for the first time, and so going forward, that's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on to see as this new wave of voters come in and start getting interested in paying attention to these events, who's going to be able to capture their attention and their support.
All right, Alex, over to you now. Who's leading in Nevada?
Well, when you look at the recent polls, it's clear there's a front-runner here in the First in the West contest, and that's former Vice President Joe Biden. In recent polls, including our own CBS News Battleground Tracker, Joe Biden has been polling steadily ahead of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, the 3 of them being the only 3 candidates to consistently clear the viability threshold. That's the kind of minimum bar of support you need to clear in order to gain delegates in this caucus contest. But that was even before yesterday's news for Joe Biden, which was the endorsement of Representative Dina Titus, who represents this congressional district right here in the heart of Las Vegas. It's the diverse urban core of the city, and it represents a key boost for Joe Biden as he looks to compete in what is a crucial test for the states and the cities booming Latino population, booming Asian American population, and booming labor union constituency. So it's been a great month for Joe Biden here in Nevada.
LaCrai, you're in South Carolina. Which names are popping up in that state?
Well, similar to what Alex just described in Nevada, I'd have to say that over the summer and into this month even, former Vice President Joe Biden has been the runaway favorite by some standards, leading polls in the state by more than 20%. And so, you know, while he's been the front runner, you've had Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders have done like a flip-flop between second and third place in our battleground tracker from earlier in the summer until now. And then what you've seen is everyone else sort of falls beneath that. And Senator Kamala Harris, while she's made the most visits to the state, she this week made 15 visits for her. She has continue to drop a little. And she's mobilizing with different coalitions here with women, and her supporters that I've talked to, at least over the weekend and even as recent as yesterday, say they trust her, but she has seen a drop. Now, Senator Bernie Sanders, he has the biggest team here. He's got 62 paid staffers on the ground with 2 paid consultants. They have offices, and they've been making tours regularly throughout the PD area, which is a rural area here in the state. I think the big takeaway would be, though, that even though former Vice President Biden has enjoyed a comfortable lead, he's made it clear, and so has his state director here, that they're going to continue to come back. They're not taking that vote for granted. On Friday, he was asked if he felt comfortable about the lead, and he said yes, because he's performed well in the African American community for a while. But I think we'll continue to see him come back. And another thing of note is that I think it's still pretty early. You know, I talk to the state director regularly here of the Democratic Party, and he reminds me all the time that this is like the early frost. You know, it may look one way, but as things start to warm up here, especially in January, things may turn out to be another. So I'm going to continue to keep out looking for this, because I think what we'll see is that as time progresses, you don't know if his lead, if former Vice President Biden's lead will dwindle. But right now, he's comfortably the front runner here.
LaCrai, let me ask you just one more question on what's happening in South Carolina. You mentioned Kamala Harris and obviously Joe Biden, who enjoys that comfortable lead. Part of the criticism from some Democrats with Mayor Pete Buttigieg has been that he's not been able to attract African-American voters to support him. What kind of operation does the Buttigieg campaign have on the ground? And what are you hearing from folks about why Mayor Pete is just not resonating with them?
Sure. You know, so as of last week, they had 4 offices here, 40-plus paid staffers on the ground. And it is worth noting that they were a little later in the game in terms of hiring a state director, a South Carolina-based communications director. And so they are building, but they were a little later to the game. And look, from critics here on the ground, I hear that they say that they think he has a problem with African Americans in South Bend. So how will he be able to relate with African Americans here or anywhere else? However, it is worth noting that I occasionally run into some Buttigieg supporters here, and they say that he seems sharp. And because he's doing so well in some of the other early states like Iowa, they're ready to listen to what he has to say. So ahead of the last debate, that was something that I heard from a couple of voters, that I'm going to be listening out for him tonight because he's doing so well in these other states. I want to see what the hype is about, so to speak. But the criticism lies with people not feeling like he relates and connects well with African Americans in South Bend. And the other thing is that a couple weeks ago, it came out that in one of the very small newspapers here, it was released that 400 people endorsed the Douglas plan, and it came out that not all of those 400 endorsers knew that they were being considered an endorser. And so there was a little bit of, miscommunication there, as I'm sure his campaign would call it. And so that sort of led some people feeling like maybe their operation isn't all the way above board either. So those are some of the criticisms that I've heard.
So, Nicole, often in the news we focus on New Hampshire and Iowa because they are the first in the state for the primaries and caucuses. And so we look to them as bellwether states. But Julian Castro brought up something, very interesting. He sort of said that maybe they should lose that position because they really don't accurately reflect the demographics of the country. And they certainly don't reflect the demographics and the diversity of the Democratic Party. He can say that because he's Polling probably in the single digits,
Right.
if that, so he can take that risk. I think other candidates would not take that risk. But can we talk a little bit more about that and sort of, and I wonder if you've heard any reaction to that comment?
Well, other candidates have not taken that risk, and typically when you ask folks like Mayor Pete Buttigieg or Senator Elizabeth Warren or Senator Bernie Sanders, they'll tell you that they're happy that both Iowa and New Hampshire remain in the primary calendar, but they're also happy that Nevada and South Carolina get to raise their voice soon thereafter, and that Super Tuesday has moved up. But facts are facts, and both Iowa and New Hampshire are in the top 10 whitest states in the United States of America. According to the 2018 Census Bureau, New Hampshire, where I'm standing right here, is 93% white. And I brought this up to Secretary of State Bill Gardner yesterday, asked him to react to some of that criticism, and he acknowledged it. He also pointed, though, to what he calls some socioeconomic diversity here in the Granite State, some diverse geography that they have, but facts are facts, and it's true that 93% of New Hampshire voters are in fact white. He also pointed to, however, the high turnout rate amongst New Hampshire voters. He said that the kind of retail politics that happens here cannot be repeated in other parts of the country. He noted that back in 2016, during the presidential primary, 62% of registered voters showed up. And so there's a lot of arguments going on, but certainly even New Hampshire voters that I speak with on the ground here certainly acknowledge that there is a lack of diversity, and that has been more and more a part of the conversation, certainly this year especially because it is the 100th anniversary of New Hampshire holding its first in the nation primary.
Alex, over to you now in Nevada. So the DNC, as you know, has signed off on a new plan for early caucus voting. What can you tell us about these changes, and how, more importantly, is it going to affect turnout in the state?
Well, you have to look first at a brief history lesson to 2016, the aftermath of 2016, when the DNC looked back at itself. They created what was called the Unity Reform Commission and said, let's figure out ways to either make states more accessible in their primary and caucus process. Let's encourage states to leave caucuses for primaries if they can. But for states like Iowa and Nevada that decided to stick with their caucus, let's figure out ways to make those contests more accessible, more diverse, more inclusive. And so what they've done here in Nevada is they've created a new what's called a delegate selection plan with a whole bunch of reforms that the state party estimates will cost them over $2 million in total this year to run, that will, they say, create record turnout. I was on a press call with Tom Perez yesterday with some reporters, and he estimated that the early vote process, which is new to the caucus process, where as early as February 15th, voters will be able to go to one of over 70 early vote sites across the state, walk in and rank their top 3 to 5 preferences for the Democratic caucus. They estimate that will lend to record turnout. Between that and presidential, caucus ballots that are in a number of languages, including Tagalog, which is the language used by the booming Filipino community here, and obviously Spanish as well as English, they estimate that this caucus, they hope, will be the most inclusive caucus, the most diverse caucus, and will help tamp down some of those criticisms from people who say, well, why aren't we just a primary state like everyone else?
Musadiq, last week we saw Democrats wrap up a second week of public hearings in the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. What are voters in Iowa telling you about the impeachment? Is it important to them? Are they taking a stand? Is it something that they're talking about when they speak to some of the candidates?
The thing about impeachment with voters that I speak with here in Iowa is almost everyone supports the inquiry, but they will always tell me that they don't believe President Trump should have been elected to office in the first place. And while they support the inquiry, they are somewhat wary of the president being indicted once this thing gets to the Senate. Others will tell me that they are a little bit hesitant about what this could mean for the country. The important thing for Democratic voters here is beating President Trump at the ballot box in 2020. It's an issue that outside of healthcare seems to be a very important topic for Democrats, which is why I often hear voters here tell me that no matter who the Democratic nominee is, they'll end up supporting them because they care so much about making sure that they beat President Trump. And it's a topic that doesn't come up during campaign stops very often. Folks want to be able to hear what candidates have to say on the issues like healthcare and climate change and gun violence. And when impeachment does come up, they want to know that the candidates can do their job on Congress and on Capitol Hill, but also pay attention to the bread and butter issues that matter to folks here on the ground.
Yep, that's what you hear over and over again whenever we bring up that topic. Nicole, LaCrai, Musadiq, and Alex, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.